All right. Hello, everyone. How's everybody doing today? Yes, I am alive. I feel better. I should not be losing my voice today. At least I hope not. And also, although the start of this chapter is a little dense in terms of all of the Ramsey Lewis stuff, it's actually a shorter chapter, which is kind of nice. So maybe we'll finish a little early today. Although you never know, because we are considering some interesting thought experiments toward the kind of the second half of the lecture. And you never know how those are going to go because people always like to discuss, how those thought experiments get their intuitions pumping, right? So um, we might finish early. We might not. If we don't finish early, that's fine. But if we finish early, that is also fine. So we're kind of continuing our discussion of functionalism. Last time we were talking about Turing machine functionalism, right? The sort of functionalism that's due to Hilary Putnam, who was following the work of Alan Turing. Um, and on machine functionalism, the mind is like a probabilistic Turing machine. Now, I know we talked about how Turing machines have parts, right? They have a tape. They have cells on that tape. Information can be written into the cells. Um, that information, it's symbols, and these symbols are representations. Um, there's a machine table. We learned that although Turing machines, as Turing conceived them, were deterministic, discrete state machines. Um, Putnam theorized that we're probabilistic Turing machines. So we're not, at least the idea is that way, we're not robots, right? Now, although there are these parts, we have to remember that Turing machines are like imaginary or conceptual machines or theoretical machines, right? And the idea is that we are the same sort of thing. Like the idea that we left off with at the end of the last lecture was that our psychology is part of a theoretical psychology that could be described as a really, really, really big probabilistic Turing machine table, right? And so for that reason, right, the physical realization is not really important, because on the one hand, Turing machines are imaginary, and as we saw when we talked about identity theory, um, we run into problems when we identify mental states with kinds of physical states. Um, so just like you can have a calculator in the form of a pocket calculator or a calculator app on your phone or an abacus, right? You can have a mind that is a computer, a Turing machine, or a digital computer, or a human brain, or some kind of non-human animal brain, right? Um, so it's the functional relations between all of the parts, all of the states of the system that are what are important. These relations are what mediate the input-output sort of. These relations are what um, really constitute these input-output relations, right? So, for example, if I suffer tissue damage, then my C fibers fire, and that is one way of implementing the mental state of being in pain, and the output I get is pain behavior, the winces and groans and stuff. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? Maybe Martians with a different physiology, to use the running example, have different pain behavior, but the functional role of all those internal states going from the inputs to outputs is the same. Well, then they're in pain. Now, causal theoretical functionalism, which is what we're talking about today, views this relation as causal. It's a causal relation. So some inputs cause internal changes. These could be changes in mental states, even. And these can cause yet other things. These could cause behavior. These could cause other mental states. But the key is that causal theoretical functionalism emphasizes the causal powers of these different states. This is how Kim puts it, right? Kim says causal theoretical functionalism conceives of this input-output relationship as a causal relation, one that is mediated by mental states. Different mental states are different because they are implicated in different input-output causal relationships. Pain differs from itch in that each has its own distinctive causal role. Pains are typically caused by tissue damage and cause winces, groans, and escape behavior. In contrast, itches are typically caused by skin irritation and cause scratching. Um, so you see it there, right? The emphasis is on these relations as causal relations, as opposed to like different states of a Turing machine. Now, there's a worry Kim raises and then deals with by using the Ramsey-Lewis method. Um, we want to avoid a worry over circularity, right? Why would this? Why would there be such a worry on functionalism? Well, on causal theoretical functionalism, and on machine functionalism, um, mental states are defined by their relationships with other states, including mental states. And so, if you're defining mental states in relation to mental states, which are further defined in terms of other mental states, and so on, you get an infinite regress, or perhaps even a circle. And we don't want that. Whenever we have circularity, like whenever we get a circular argument in philosophy, or whenever we get an infinite regress, that is a problem. That means our explanation isn't working. When it comes to particular mental states, for example, Kim writes, to explain what a given mental state is, like pain, we need to refer to other mental states, and explaining these can only be expected to require reference to further mental states. So pain might be defined with reference to other mental states like distress, or as we'll, or being alert. But to define those, you have to define them in relation to other mental states, and that's a problem, right? This is a process, Kim says, that can go on in an unending regress or loop back into a circle. That's for particular mental states. But more generally, there's a worry, right? Um, in the functionalist conception of mentality itself, as Kim says, uh, to be a mental state is to be an internal state serving as a causal intermediary between sensory inputs and mental states as causes on the one hand, and behaviors and other mental states as effects on the other. Viewed as a definition of what it is to be a mental state, this is obviously circular. Just because generally, like, there's a problem with defining particular mental states in reference to other mental states, but that means that more generally, just the idea of defining mental states in relation to other mental states is going to cause us problems. Machine functionalism deals with this by using the Turing machine, right? There's no circularity because what we're saying is that, look, these mental states like that I have, if I am a probabilistic Turing machine, then my mental states are like the logical states of a Turing machine. And the physical stuff that implements it, that's like that's just the physical realization of a Turing machine. And it doesn't matter how we physically realize it. It's just the point that there is some physical implementation of this sort of, imaginary conceptual thing that we call a Turing machine. Causal theoretical functionalism does it a little bit differently. It exploits causal relations involving our mental states to escape the worry of circularity. Now, here's where we get into the tricky bit. Actually, I'd like to ask you all, who found this part a little like, what? Like, what's happening? Or, you can also say if you thought, this wasn't that bad. This Ramsey-Lewis method wasn't that bad. Yeah. Holly says, yeah. Yeah, it's like, what? Or, yeah, this isn't that bad. What do you think? Oh, you're confused. No problem. Because remember, that's what I'm here for. Um, I think that the reason why it might be a little bit difficult to grasp is because it's very formal and very abstract, right? but I'm going to explain it all. So we're going to use an example, a sort of toy theory of pain, as Kim describes it. This is a general theory of pain. It's not complete, it's just a toy example, but T is our theory. So our theory is T. For any X, which is anything that could be in pain, if X suffers tissue damage and is normally alert, X is in pain. That just defines what it is to be in pain. You're an X, you're say a human, you're normally alert, you suffer tissue damage, then you are in pain. If you are awake, you tend to be normally alert. Okay? Yeah. So this is just kind of defining more of our theory. So if I'm normally alert and I have tissue damage, if I'm in pain. If I'm awake, I'm probably normally alert. If I'm in pain, I'm going to make winces and groans and enter into another mental state, a state of distress. But if I'm not normally alert, or if I'm in a state of distress, then maybe I don't wince and groan. I just make more typing errors, right? So this, just to keep it clear what everything means here, the italics are giving us non-mental predicates, which give us our objectively observable stuff. So suffering tissue damage, wincing and groaning, making typing errors, being awake. These are the publicly observable behaviors. Um, the bold font are the psychological predicates. So, is in pain, is normally alert, is in distress. Those are psychological predicates. They are predicating properties, mental properties, to our X. And what this is doing basically is showing or trying to describe law-like relations between these mental states and these behaviors. That's all this does. Now, it's not an exhaustive theory of pain, obviously, right? I mean, maybe if I'm not normally alert or I'm in a state of distress, I don't make more typing errors. Maybe I'm normally alert, but I'm so focused on cooking the perfect hamburger that I don't notice the pain for where I sliced my hand a few minutes ago, right? So that's what it means to say this is just a toy theory. But what it does is it lays out these law-like relations between the non-mental predicates and the psychological predicates. So what this just says is that I have a theory of pain, and that theory is that if some entity is awake and suffers tissue damage, it will be in pain. And if it is in pain, it will go into a state of distress. If it's not normally alert and awake, or if it's in a state of distress, that entity might make more mistakes when typing on a keyboard. That's it. That's all this says. Yeah, well, and our pain theory, if we wanted it to be super exhaustive, would have to have something like that. Like, if somebody has some kind of congenital disorder where they don't experience pain, then X will not. Then maybe his C fibers will fire, but he won't be in pain and he won't be making any winces and groans, right? Like that movie Novocaine. Anybody see that movie? That would be an interesting way to try and make our theory of pain describe this guy. I can't remember the character's name. He's played by Jack Quaid, but he doesn't feel pain, and he's got to, rescue his damsel in distress from these criminals, and he he gets shot and burned, and all kinds of horrible things happen, which make us, the viewer, wince and groan in sympathetic pain, but the character doesn't experience pain. We would have to more typing errors. Jerry, that just means that if I'm in pain, it's going to affect behavior. Like I'm typing at my keyboard, but I'm in pain. So my typing becomes poorer. It's just a silly example of the way that pain might affect behavior other than winces and groans, right? Like imagine I just had like last summer, I had my wisdom tooth. I had to have a wisdom tooth out. And I was wincing and groaning, but I was also like I was also, not as sharp. I was forgetting stuff because I'm distracted by my pain, right? And so here maybe our X is distracted by their pain, and so they make more typing errors. It's awfully random. Like it's a random example. I think Kim used it because maybe he's typing up his book, right? And he's like, maybe if I'm in pain, I don't know, I make more typing errors, right? Because I'm typing right now. It's just the example that came to his mind, right? Oh yeah, Joshua. Yeah, no. uh, well, maybe not. I mean, maybe this is unique to Kim. Like I said, I got my tooth out and I didn't have to be anesthetized because it wasn't like right in there. It was out, but it was just had a bunch of cavities. Or maybe it wasn't last summer. Maybe it was the summer before. Anyway, it wasn't a big deal. I didn't make more typing errors, but I was for a few days just kind of like, oh yeah, I got to go do that thing. I forgot because I was sitting here thinking about how my face hurts, right? So everybody understands what our theory says, right? It says that there's going to be something, an X, and if it suffers tissue damage and it's normally awake and aware, it's in pain. Um, if it's in pain, it's going to behave a certain way if it's in this sort of mental state, like if it's normally awake and alert. But if it's not normally alert, or if I go into a state of distress, then my pain behavior might be something else. So it's causal. It shows some of the causal relations between the inputs, the tissue damage, the mental states, being normally alert, being in pain, and being in distress, and the outputs, wincing and groaning, making typing errors, etc. It spells out the law-like relations from the inputs through the middle to the outputs. Now, if you're still like, what? Just think of this in terms of the classical sandwich, right? Which I've illustrated before, right? We have inputs, and then they go into the let's call this the mind. Some computation happens here, and then we get our outputs. So inputs, computation, outputs. And here the inputs are tissue damage. The computation involves moving between being normally alert and in pain and distress, and the outputs are our pain behaviors, right? Yes, absolutely. Because remember, I mean, we're still kind of like this is not incompatible with the Turing machine functionalism, as we'll see. Uh, and so if that's right, if we are probabilistic Turing machines, then this is what this is describing are like probabilistic causal relations rather than deterministic ones. So I could go into a state of distress or I could not. Maybe I'm used to pain, right? Maybe I'm like one of those, maybe I work at the circus, right? And I'm used to doing all kinds of weird stuff like swallowing swords and spitting fire and, juggling knives or whatever, right? So maybe if I go into a state of pain, I don't go into a state of distress at all. Um, yeah, there are lots of other examples you could think of. Um, So, and that could be different for different people, or like it could be the same. Maybe one time I'm in pain and I'm like, ow, I'm in a state of distress. Maybe another time I'm in pain and I'm not in a state of distress. I mean, there are people like that, right? You know who I'm talking about? Those people that, that they enjoy pain, right? Um, it's an example. Well, like a runner's high or the pump, right? Where you're kind of sore from a workout, but it also feels really good and satisfying. Um, yeah, masochists. Yeah, masochists like being in pain. There is, and I'm sorry if this is a bit of a weird example, but there is the BDSM community. um, those people don't seem to go into a state of distress when in pain. You know, So, and I'm not trying to yuck anyone's yum here. It is what it is. But yeah, so there's a simple theory that doesn't nearly begin to describe everything about pain. But what it does allow us to do is apply this Ramsey-Lewis method, which comes from two thinkers named Ramsey and Lewis, where what we do is we existentially generalize over the particular psychological predicates that occurred in our theory T. And then we get TR for like our theory that's been Ramsified. So this says something pretty much like our first one. It's just generalized. So we're not talking specifically about pain. Um, I mean, we are in terms of the observable behavior, but the mental states could be anything, right? So we've replaced being normally alert, being in pain, and being in distress with M1, M2, and 3. So we've turned, as I say here, our predicate constants into predicate variables. So statements from T like is normally alert or is in pain, those are predicate constants. They're actual predicates, actual properties that we predicate to X. So we say X has these mental states. Uh, but these are variables, M1, M2. Um, they refer to being normally alert, being in pain, but they could refer to any mental state. We like a variable in a math equation, right? Um, what's a good example of a math equation that we would all be familiar with that has constants and variables? Well, does anyone remember? Yeah, the quadratic one. So, like, if I remember correctly from high school, when we were doing a bunch of stuff, constant twos and fours. Can you give us that formula, Sam? Because I think I'm thinking of a different one.
Okay, so it's probably easier to say than it is to type, to be perfectly frank.
Sure.
So it's negative b. So you start off with an equation. We'll start with it where it has um something to the x. Like so, we're going to call ax squared
Sure.
plus bx plus c. So we have a, b, and c, and we're trying to find. Well, yeah, that's basically Joshua. Joshua tries to specify, yeah, x, like
Right.
so x, the variable x is equal to negative b plus or minus, because we're trying to find two roots of the equation. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, that whole thing, and you divide that by 2a.
Yeah, that's perfect. So these are the constants in this formula. So those are not going to change depending on what particular thing you're trying to solve, right? But your variables, your A's, B's, and C's, are going to change. And that's the same here. We're just doing something like this. See, this gives you an idea. Remember when we were talking about functionalism and I was talking about antecedents of functionalism, and we mentioned Thomas Hobbes, and Hobbes was like saying that thinking is reckoning. Like when a man reasoneth, he reckons, but he does it with words and what we would call concepts rather than strictly speaking numbers. That's what we're doing here, right? And I think you can see this. You can kind of see what Hobbes was saying when we look at this example. But here, negative b, b, a, and c, those are going to be whatever they need to be for us to solve this problem. Like we're going to get those and plug them into the formula, but 4 and 2 are not going to change. You always have to, you always have to, keep those values the same. So they're constants. But in our example, we can turn our constants into variables so that in this case, they can mean is normally alert, is in pain, or is in a state of distress. But really, in theory, we could have them mean something else if we wanted to. So we're that's what we mean by existentially generalizing. We're saying instead of this particular psychological predicate, there is this mental state, and that might be any such state. And so that's what TR says. It says there exist states M1, M2, and M3 such that for any X, if X suffers tissue damages in 1, then X is in M2. So there exist mental states of being normally alert, being in pain, and being in a state of distress, such that for any entity, if X suffers tissue damage and is normally alert, X is in pain. That's what this first part says before the semicolon. To continue, if X is awake, then X tends to be normally alert. If X is in pain, X winces and groans and goes into a state of distress. And if X is either not normally alert or is in a state of distress, then X will make more typing errors. So we've existentially generalized the psychological predicates, and we've left our sort of physical descriptions, our publicly observable stuff, the way it is. That's what all this means. It's just an existential. So TR is just an existentially generalized version of T. Now, what Ramsey showed is that TR is weaker than T. It's as powerful as it needs to be in terms of physical behavioral prediction as T. TR is weaker because it's less specific, I take it, right? So T, we can existentially generalize it as TR. And we can see that these two theories, T and TR, make exactly the same deductive connections between the non-psychological statements, right? Nothing about the winces and groans and the typing errors changes when we existentially generalize. This is just a different way of putting T. Okay. How are we doing so far? I hope I'm explaining it clear enough. No, it's not like a prob. It's not like that. I can see why, right? Because again, we're probabilistic Turing machines. But this isn't about working out the probability of whether X will wince and groan or make typing errors. What it is a way is it's getting us to a way where we can say in predicate logic, we can describe our theory in like logic. That's what this is getting us toward. Yeah. It's about and I guess I'll say it's not really about prediction in the sense of thinking about probabilities. It's about describing these law-like causal relations in a formal way. That's what we're doing. Although, oh, I probably shouldn't even mention this. You could use this to create a robot that behaves in a certain way. I mean, one of the first autonomous robots was called Shaky, and Shaky used this kind of logical language to solve problems where you have a state of affairs that you want to obtain, like take the red ball from room number 1 and bring it to room number 3. And so Shaky looks at the goal state and the current state and then solves how to get to the goal state by doing predicate logic basically. Um, but don't worry about that, okay? That's just me nerding out. Um, yeah, Kaya, you're right. There are these simulators. In fact, I was at a conference one time, a robo philosophy conference in Denmark, and there were some roboticists from Japan had come to the conference. There was Hiroshi Ishiguro, he's the guy who has that robot double of himself. Um, he was a really weird dude, but also so cool. I like asked him a question, and he came to my talk, and I was just I was kind of starstruck. But that some of the one of the people he was working with was presenting right before me, and he showed an example of a dental robot which produced pain behavior if you were a dental student and you're trying to clean its teeth, and if you poke it in the wrong way, the robot would wince and groan, right? That sounds like maybe the sort of thing Kai is describing that they have for nursing students. Um, of course, the robot doesn't really feel pain, but it might be useful for training people. It's certainly better than having, nursing students causing actual pain in real patients, right? Um, so, um, yeah. So are we feeling okay about what's happening so far? Yeah, it's like playing Operation, right? The robots, I mean, not the Ramsey Lewis method. Lee's feeling good. That's good. Don't be afraid, because I have been open about the fact that I am not a logic guy. I am an ordinary language guy, like through and through. But I understand this. It's intimidating, like especially if you're somebody with maybe like math anxiety, which I also experience. Like I can do math. I don't enjoy it. I'm not confident about it, but I can do it if push comes to shove. But it's not my preferred thing. Um, and maybe you're like me, and the first time you read this, you were like, "What? What is it you're saying there, Professor Kim?" But it's actually it's pretty straightforward. So we have our theory T. So I'll just go back to reiterate, right? We have our theory T, which says that our entity, if it suffers tissue damage and it's normally alert, it experiences pain. If it's awake, it's normally alert, and if it's in pain, it winces and groans, et cetera, et cetera. That's just describing these sort of causal relations between tissue damage, which is the physical cause, a mental state as a cause, which is being normally alert, and the consequence of these two causes, the effect, being in pain. And then there are further effects that being in pain causes. Being in pain might cause you to wince and groan, or to make more typing mistakes, or to be in a state of distress. So this is just a way of illustrating how mental states can be caused by physical things that impinge on your nervous system, as well as other mental states. And these mental states can cause other mental states, and they can cause behavior. That's what's captured here. And then here, this is just an existentially generalized version of that, so that we're not talking about particular psychological predicates. But we're talking about these predicate variables, which could mean this could mean is in pain, or we could change this around and say maybe we've got this weird case where this person does not experience pain. So they can be normally alert, and maybe instead of pain, they experience an itch. And that itch causes them to go into a state of distress, right? So these could mean whatever we want them to mean. And now we can define our psychological expressions without the worry of circularity. Now we can abbreviate TR as this. So we put the existential quantifier in there. That's what that backwards letter E looking thing means. That just means there exists. Now we can define what it is for our entity to be in pain. So X is in pain means, after the definitions, that there exists mental state 1, 2, and 3, such that at a time T, there are these three mental states that X could be in, and X is in M2, which is the variable that we've decided will represent is in pain. Okay, are we good with this? Actually, a good question to ask would be, have any of you ever done any computer programming? Yeah, so if you're in computer programming, you know that the way this is structured might look a bit like what you see in certain code or pseudocode, because it's basically a way of implementing logic, right? I love when I meet and this is not about any of the computer science people who are here, obviously, because you're taking a philosophy course, but I love it when computer science people are like, well, what's up with philosophy? What's that good for? Well, logic is one thing, so you're welcome. I mean, computers are basically just implementing logical relations using electrical circuits. Yeah, so Josh, you know what I mean, right? Like, this is kind of structured the way you would see, like, arguments in maybe a certain computer program, right? So it just means that to be in pain, there exists these mental states, and at this time where you could be moving between these three mental states, you are at the present time in the mental state of being at pain. So states that are contingent on other states in causal chains. Yeah, yeah, like there are mental states that might cause other mental states, and they might also cause behavior. Yeah, I figured. Yeah, no meaning the computer science stuff. Yeah. No, I figured. And we can do this for all the other predicate variables. Like, what is it for x to be normally alert? Well, we just have our definitions. There exists these three mental states, M1, M2, M3, which refer to being normally alert, being in pain, and being in distress. And at time t, x is in M1. So that just means, okay, for x to be normally alert out of these mental states at this time, x is in M1, which means normally alert. And likewise with distress, there exists mental states M1, M2, and 3, and at our time t, which is just like at whatever time it is, and you're in M3, that means you're in a state of distress. So after all of this, you might be in pain yourself. You might be an X and you are in mental state too. See what I did there? Uh, so what does this all say in plain language is probably what you really want to know, right? Yeah, you're wincing and groaning, right? So you want to know what this says in plain language, right? Kaya, go ahead.
Yeah, so th this just brings me back to the Turing test, where how just with time, AI and other machines are becoming really good at the test, and I'm wondering if eventually, if we give robotics and computers the ability to understand pain, like for example, they conduct an error, then part of their like it's built into so that they harm their own hardware, so there's an understanding of consequences. And if that happens, then is there like a possibility that that's how the Turing test would have to be conducted, or like would it have to be approached in a different way?
Yeah. Well, so uh, so my thoughts, like as I was saying last time on the Turing test, is that it might not actually be that useful or necessary um, to determine whether a particular machine can think. Like, I'm not sure if it's actually very useful as a test for that. Um, and it certainly need not, like, you could understand it that way. Like, if we wanted to test whether machines experience, that could be understood as a kind of Turing test. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that Turing originally conceived the test as a test of intelligence, not as a test of conscious experience, right? That said, what you described there, Kaya, kind of reminds me of something called the total Turing test, which is where you don't have just a teletype written sort of series of messages. What you have is a fully embodied entity that is physically and behaviorally indistinguishable from a person, and then you submit that to the test. And what that version of the Turing test is for is actually it's a response to the Chinese room. And so that version of the Turing test, it would be an interesting question, like whether something experiences pain. Um, but what it is, it's not really a test that's meant to be run. It's actually meant as a response to John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment, where, sure, the person in the room doesn't understand, but if there were an embodied agent that was behaviorally and physically indistinguishable from a human, and we let that out into the world, it would understand things, and it would maybe know what it's like to feel pain or something, right? Um, so yeah, if you're curious about this, I can point you in the direction of some of the work by like I think it's Stephen Harnad out of I think the University of Montreal. Um, anyway, if you're interested, let me know. But yeah, that reminds me a bit of the total Turing test. So what does this mean in plain language? Well, Kim writes, it says that you are in pain just in case there are certain states, M1, M2, M3, that are related amongst themselves, and with such physical behavioral states as tissue damage, wincing and groaning, and type and performance as specified in TR, and you are in M2. So we have a theory of pain now, where our mental states feature as causes and effects along with all of the physical and behavioral states, and they're all interdefined, so there's no circularity. So that's nice. And we can even, and this is why I said earlier that this is compatible with machine functionalism, we can think of the Turing machine approach as a special case of the Ramsey-Lewis method, in which the psychological theory is presented in the form of a Turing machine table with the internal machine states, the Q's, corresponding to the predicate variables, the M's. So really, Turing machine functionalism is a specific case of this Ramsey-Lewis method, because instead of being super existentially generalized like in the Ramsey-Lewis method, the predicate variables are just states of a Turing machine. All right, how do we feel? Hard part's over. Okay, that's the hard part. The hard part's over. Now, since you are all maybe X's who are in M2 and therefore wincing and groaning, etc., we could take a short break before we get to what underlying psychology we want to choose, um, or what underlying psychology we want to include in our theory. How does that sound to everybody? Because we are actually, I hope I'm not going too fast, but we are actually just about halfway through. Yeah, okay, let's do a quick break. So I have 3:17. Let's come back in 10 minutes at 3:27. And then we'll talk about whether we want to go with scientific psychology or folk psychology. Yes, Holly, that's a yes to your direct message. We'll probably finish early, so yes. Okay, I'll see you all in about 10 minutes. All right. So, I hope we're all refreshed after our brain break. Share the screen. Okay, so just to reiterate, what we've got here, um, we've got our theory of pain T, which we've existentially generalized using the Ramsey-Lewis method to get TR. And the important takeaway is that on TR, we can define all of our terms. So all of our, all of these predicate variables and all of these psychological variables are defined in terms of other mental states, other physical states. It's all interdefined, so we don't have to worry about circularity, but we need to pick an underlying psychology for our theory. Our theory, if it's going to be a proper theory, should explain all psychological states, not just pain. And it should encapsulate sufficient information about each state, right? What are the inputs that cause this mental state? What are the outputs of that mental state? Whether it's pain, whether it's itch, whether it's whatever, that allow us to identify that state as such. Because remember, it's functionalism. Mental states are defined in terms of their functional relations or their causal relations, in this case, with other mental states, with inputs from the nervous system, with behavioral outputs, etc. Right. So we want our theory to be a proper theory. Now, Kim kind of launches into a bit of a discussion here about the status of psychology as a science. Um, we want psychology to be an actual science, right? And I think it is a science. Um, but as Kim points out, you know, it's a fairly young science, right? It's only a little over 100 years old. Um, Other sciences are much older. You know, physics, modern physics is a lot older. You know, goes back to uh, well, the start of the scientific revolution, really. So physics has been around for much longer, and physicists are definitely able to identify and describe law-like causal relations. You know, that's what laws of nature are. They're physical descriptions of law-like relations in the natural world. Can we do that with psychology? Maybe. One thing that Kim seems to want psychology to be able to do that sort of thing, but at present, psychologists don't really identify and describe laws, but rather effects, what they call effects. Um, and the reason is probably to do with the fact that the mind is just so complicated. Sure, in psychophysics, there are like things that are described in a law-like way, but it's still very subjective. Uh, Kim is pretty optimistic about the prospects of psychology. So am I. I'm just not sure if identifying laws, like mental laws, is something that psychology is going to be able to do anytime soon because psychology is just so darn complicated. Um, and that's why psychologists typically, like if you look at cognitive psychology, they identify effects. So there's all kinds of effects in psychology, and sometimes they also posit information processing mechanisms, which we can then go and try to actually find by looking at the brain and see if the brain realizes this information processing mechanism versus that information processing mechanism, right? That's something we can actually check. So it's mechanisms and its effects. What are some effects in psychology? If you just took my philosophy of the paranormal course, you'll probably know of a couple of them. Yeah, the ideomotor effect, right? So the ideomotor effect is when um, people unconsciously make movements and they think they are not the author of those actions, but that's simply because they're not consciously aware of initiating the action. That's called the ideomotor effect. It's not a law, right? It's just something that seems to happen that we've noticed. What's another one? We talked a lot about the Barnum effect. Yeah, the Barnum effect, Holly. Yeah. Like the Barnum effect is when uh, you think a statement applies specifically to you, but it's actually so vague, so general that it could apply to anybody. And there are lots of other effects in psychology. A big famous one would be like the Stroop effect. Anybody completed a Stroop task before? Yeah. You could go online and do a Stroop task if you wanted to, but a Stroop task is when you have yeah, Josh, exactly. Astrology works because of, well, it doesn't work, but people think it works because of the Barnum effect. Basically, yeah. When Forer, the psychologist who identified that, it's also called the Forer effect. And Forer was initially looking into personality tests because personality tests like the Myers-Briggs, they also suffer from this problem. But what he did is he actually pulled examples from newspaper horoscopes in order to get his Barnum statements. So that's an interesting little bit of history. Yeah, but a Stroop task is where you have to read a word, and so maybe the word is red, red, red. Now the text might be red, or it might be some other color. It could be green, and your task is to either the read the word or identify the color of the word. Yeah, like Holly says, you want to identify the color of the word, not the word itself. So the word brown might be shown to you with purple letters, and you have to say, as Holly describes, the color of the letters, but not the word. And it shows what the Stroop task does is kind of show us like what our brain is processing first in that information processing sort of chain that goes from the eyes to again producing speech outputs. Am I what is my brain doing first? I might be reading the word, but if I might say the wrong thing, brown might be in purple letters, and I'll say purple because I'm identifying the color of the letters and not reading the word. Yeah, the bystander effect is another one. A lot of people standing around. Um, yeah, and yeah, we can vary this up. Our Stroop task might be go, no go, or something like. But the point is, it helps us see what's happening when in that information processing chain. And then we can actually go and look in the brain and see how it's potentially realized, right? But the point is, it's not a law. It does not describe law-like relations. It just, I mean, it certainly describes something causal, but it's not as rigorous as like the laws that physics describe. So, yeah, psychology right now is all about effects and mechanisms. Amazing. I didn't know about that one. I experienced that a lot, I think. I know it. Yeah, that it's true. I have that. I think when I play video games sometimes, where I'm like, no, when people rage quit video games, that might be the fuck it effect, as it's called. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Dieting. Well, yeah, because dieting's tough. Yeah. Yeah, maybe not everyone gives up. Maybe other people like Samuel, they're like, all right, I'm gonna lock in and I'm gonna do this, right? Yeah, we ball. So yeah, okay. So my sort of little spiel about psychology is not quite the same as Kim's, but I think I'm optimistic about psychology as a science. I mean, I'm a cognitive scientist, so if I didn't believe psychology worked, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, right? But what underlying psychology should we pick for our theory? One is common sense psychology. Sometimes this is called folk psychology because we have this sort of folk notion of understanding, the sort of folky means of understanding other people's behaviors, understanding what people mean by what they say, um, and even predicting behavior on that basis, right? Um, the example I've used earlier in the course was like if I have my partner leaves for work in the morning and she takes her umbrella. Well, what would explain that behavior? Well, maybe she believes it's going to rain and she doesn't, she desires not to get rained on. And so that explains why she took the umbrella, right? That's folk psychology. We also call it propositional attitude psychology because, again, those propositional attitudes, those um, those attitudes like beliefs and desires that we take towards propositions, statements about the world with an embedded that clause, that's a propositional attitude. So Josh believes that it is going to rain. Sarah believes that it will be sunny in the afternoon. Josh desires not to get rained on. These are all propositional attitudes, right? And this is how we understand people in our everyday lives. And so we call it folk psychology, right? Because it's not scientific. Notice we kind of touched on this before when we talked about the belief desire or the desire belief action principle, right? How we explain behaviors in terms of these desires and beliefs causally producing actions. Again, like say my partner's going to work, she's brought her umbrella. Well, she desires to stay dry and she believes it's going to rain, therefore she brought the umbrella, right? If we choose this option, that's called analytical functionalism. Now, what do we make of folk psychology real quick? I mean, how familiar are we with this idea of folk psychology? Some philosophers don't like this approach. Um, but to me, it seems somewhat indispensable. Right, there are the eliminative reductionists, right? The reductive physicalists, like Paul and Patricia Churchland, for example, who we've seen believe that, I can't even talk about eliminative reductionism without talking about belief, right? These eliminative reductionists and their beliefs that they don't think they have. You got to be kidding me. But anyway, they say like belief, desire, these mentalistic terms one day will be like phlogiston or the luminiferous ether or elan vital, right? We won't need them to explain anything, right? But to me, that seems sort of strange. I can't even describe their position without imputing beliefs to them, nor could they describe my position on the mind without attributing beliefs to me, even though they don't believe that the beliefs are a useful explanatory thing, right? Uh, So I think that folk psychology is important and indispensable. And I think even if we are able to explain things at a lower level of analysis, like that doesn't mean we should eliminate the higher level way of talking about it, right? Um, so I don't know though. What do you think? Are you more of a reductionist than I am, or maybe you're not very reductionist and you agree? I don't know. I'm just curious what you think. Or maybe you've never even heard of folk psychology and you're thinking, "Hey, this is all new to me." I don't know. Let's get some thoughts percolating. New to Josh, that's fine. Well, Josh, you mentioned you were a engineering student. Is that right? Yeah. So, yeah, understandably, it would be new, right? Although, well, explicitly it's new, but implicitly, I would say this is what you do all of the time. So, all of you really kind of know about folk psychology implicitly because that's what we do, right? Um, Same with Lee. So Lee says they haven't heard of it, but you probably are a folk psychologist, Lee, right? When I first heard of this stuff, it was all in graduate school, and I found it very interesting because I thought it would have been really helpful, just as a sort of nerdy misfit, um, to know explicitly about folk psychology. I got to grad school and started learning about folk psychology, and I thought, where have you been all my life? Like now I can understand people. Uh, Ugh, yeah, so maybe I'm just a philosopher by nature. I don't know. But if we go with the folk psychological option, that's called analytic psychology. So that's one option. But a second option is scientific psychology. Let's see. Oh, so Josh asks, is folk psychology kind of like the notion where most people believe intuitively that the mind and body are completely separate, since it seems like it would be that way from a concept like souls. So, okay, I see what you're asking. So dualism is a folk notion, right? It's not part of it. It's not necessarily part of belief, desire, psychology, but it is a folk notion in that it comes naturally to us and it helps us make sense of the world. And it might not describe what's actually happening, but it works well enough, right? That's what we kind of mean by folk. So I would say that sort of dualism, it's not necessarily part of folk psychology, but it's a folk notion that a lot of people have. And we have folk physics, right? We have folk biology, right? Like, so folk physics. I know, like, you can toss me a ball, and I can probably catch it, right? Because, oh, the ball's coming this way. I'll put my hand. Oh, I caught it, right? Now, I'm not consciously calculating, like, okay, the ball is traveling at 20 kilometers an hour at an angle of 30 degrees. And, I'm not like literally doing the math in my head consciously, but I can see where the ball's going and I can kind of catch it, right? That's folk physics. Folk biology. I know that, if I know that I don't know about the inner biological workings of my cat, but I know that I've got to give him food and water, and I've got to make sure he takes his medication and so forth. I don't have like a veterinary level understanding of cat biology, but I know what you need to do to keep the cat alive, right? Um, and yeah, so we all have all kinds of folk notions, right? That maybe don't explain what is actually happening the way that scientific explanations do, but they explain in a way that works well enough for us to get by in our everyday lives. But scientific psychology is what like your psychology professors or your cognitive science professors do, right? They try and formulate precise theories about the causal relations between input and output. And if we choose this option, we call that psychofunctionalism. And for the psychology students or the cognitive science students in the room, you'll be very familiar with this. Like, and again, sure, we're trying to formulate precise theories, but these are theories of effects, they're not laws. I mean, maybe the psychophysics people got closest to laws. The psychophysics people are the psychophysicists are the ones who mapped things like perceived brightness to luminosity. So a subjective measurement of brightness associated in a law-like way with objective measures of light levels, or like perceived loudness with sound pressure. That's what the decibel scale measures. All of this is like the province of psychophysics. Um, but I think this is what Kim would like psychology to be doing. It's not really what they do though. And I'm saying this, Kim is obviously or was obviously a far more renowned philosopher than I have, but I've spent a lot of time doing psychology, and yeah, like we find effects. Um, yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that. But and we've already gone over a lot of examples of different effects, so I don't think we have to go over too much more. We have to choose one, and we want the one we choose to be correct, but let's not worry too much about that now. The point is that if our underlying theory is false, then if we try to generalize anything else using the Ramsey-Lewis method, um, that will also be false. So if we're going to try and generalize, if we're going to take the psychofunctionalist approach and generalize on the basis of scientific psychology, we want to make sure that that's correct. Likewise with folk psychology. Yeah. Well, um, Well, here's the thing. I mean, it is more logical and perhaps more precise. But one of the interesting things that Kim points out is that folk psychology or common sense psychology is actually a lot older than scientific psychology. Like, if you wanted to understand the actions of a character in a Greek tragedy, you're using folk psychology, not scientific psychology. Scientific psychology might have a role, um, and common sense psychology might have a role, and they might actually both be equally important. Folk psychology for our everyday life, scientific psychology for the scientific um, effort to understand the nature of the mental. So they might both have a role to play. Maybe. Um, oh, okay, so a couple interesting comments. Yeah, Kaya says, yeah, sure, there might be room for error in folk psychology. I mean, you're not wrong, but I would also counter by pointing out that there's tons of error in scientific psychology. I mean, in this class alone, we've witnessed the rise and fall of behaviorism. Um, so that's a problem. That's a problem. But yeah, you're not wrong. I would just say it goes each way, right? Um, Holly wants to recuse herself from the debate because she can see Dr. Lacroix. Yeah, Guy. I know. I think I know where you're going with this. Uh, so Professor Lacroix is he's a really good psychologist. I think I get the impression that he's leery to wade into the philosophical issues here because they're a bit less certain, right? So if you want to dip into folk psychology, maybe Guy would no, 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 but folk psychology is fine. Um, you cannot dispense with it. Like why would he wave his finger? Well, he has certain beliefs about the nature of folk psychology. You can't dismiss it, even if you're a skeptic. Oh, he did? Oh yeah. Well, that's the other thing. I mean, Guy is very philosophically literate. He told me about it back in the day. I was in his laboratory group for a little bit, and he read a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers, like the rationalists and the empiricists and stuff. He's very up to snuff on all of that. Holly, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if you read my reflection paper or somebody else did, but I didn't know that psychology was even a modern thing or that modern people partook in philosophy until he brought it up. He said,
Yeah.
"You want to understand consciousness, you really want to get into philosophy and start asking questions." And I was like, that's like men in togas from Greece, 2000.
Yeah, no, but it's true, and it's also highly interdisciplinary. So a lot of folks, not everybody, but a lot of philosophers are doing highly interdisciplinary work where they're reading the psychology papers and I try to be one of those people too. And but I do know that Guy is sometimes leery about I remember we were talking about Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, and he was like, "I don't know about that. Like, is that how it? I don't know." And I'm like, "No, let's talk about it. It sounds like really cool stuff. Don't be afraid of it." Um, but folk psychology, even if you're a scientific psychologist, I think folk psychology is somewhat indispensable. Anyway, but that's not to say that Dr. Lacroix is not he's certainly like a very interdisciplinary scholar. Like and it's nice that there are psychologists who like philosophy. So love that. Jerry says folk seems kind of non-scientific. Um, I mean it is and it isn't, right? And actually the way that so here's one of my gripes with this. The way that Kim explains scientific psychology is as the psychology you do in a lab, right? And that is scientific. But one of the ways that our folk psychology might work is theory of mind. where we actually the theory is that we explain and predict behavior by theorizing about other people's mental states. And that is something that scientists do. So all of us are like citizen scientists when we use folk psychology, right? So yeah, it's non-scientific in the sense that it's not what happens in the lab, but it is scientific in the sense that all of us are actually hypothesizing and theorizing about the causes of people's behavior. That's one explanation anyway. That's not all folk psychologists are theory theorists, but it's there, right? Um yeah. Yeah, like Josh, I agree. We couldn't really dispense with it, but in general, for like a naturalistic explanation of the mind, we want scientific psychology. But in everyday life, we don't want that. Like if I'm going to take a walk to the store, I don't need to work out ahead of time what my pace will be and how many calories I want to burn. I might do that if I'm like a serious athlete and I don't know, training for the power walking championship or something. But in my everyday life, no, I just get up and go, right? Um, so yeah. Um, yeah. I think you could look at it that way, Leo, where you look at scientific psychology as building as sort of identifying problems in folk psychology. Like one of the things scientific psychology is really good at is uh, is identifying cognitive bias. So, like scientific psychology can show us where our everyday psychology doesn't work. And then once you're aware of that, you can kind of correct for it. Like I had a professor once. Well, I was working as a TA for this professor, and in the class, this professor was teaching the students about the Harvard implicit association test, right? So this is a way of looking at reaction time by associating negative words with pictures, right? And it's been used to argue that some people have like an implicit bias against members of out groups. So they're not like explicit racists, but they have a sort of unconscious negative bias, maybe against people who are not the same ethnicity, right? Again, it doesn't mean you're like a some kind of KKK Nazi racist, but it means you might be biased so that if you were looking at like two different resumes and one has a an English name like John Jones and another has like a name from another culture, you might be biased against that other name, right? So if you take the implicit association test and you find out you have like maybe some kind of implicit bias, well, now what you can do is you have it and you can consciously take steps to not be biased, right? Uh, so that's one of the advantages of scientific psychology, right? When it over our sort of everyday way of thinking about things. Um, yeah, so okay, good discussion there. Holly read a psychology paper that pulled from philosophy to articulate and categorize encoding in the creation of kinds of implicit bias. Yeah, so nice little cross-disciplinary stuff, which is good. That's what I like to see, right? I know there's a bit of probably a bit of an ongoing debate about whether cognitive science is a single science or just a bunch of different sciences all interested in the same thing. And I don't really care what the answer is. I think what's important is that we keep talking to each other. Andy Brooke put it this way. Um, it's a bit like the parable of the five blind individuals and the elephant, right? So none of them can see, but the elephant is so big that they're all feeling different parts of the elephant. So maybe the first guy's on the trunk and he's like, "Well, this is clearly a hose." Another guy's on the leg and he says, "This is a tree." And another guy's got the tail and he says, "This is clearly a rope that I'm holding." But they're all smaller parts of one big thing that's not what any of the individuals think that it is. And I think that's a really good way of putting it. That's what cognitive scientists are. We're like the blind individuals trying to understand the elephant, but the elephant's too big for any one of us to really understand. For example's sake, let's just say we go with scientific psychology. Actually, where are we? Let's finish these two slides. I'm going to take another quick break, and then we're going to do something fun. So let's say we go with scientific psychology. We can assume that psychological theories are positing these internal states. That helps us systematize our correlations between sensory inputs and behavioral outputs and maybe other intervening mental states, right? So we have our subject S. S behaves in such and such a way. We can have two psychological theories, theory 1 and theory 2, which explain S's behavior. Okay, sounds good. But maybe T1 and T2 posit different inner states, so different causal chains from inputs to outputs. But both explain S's behavior equally well. If we Ramseyfy one of the theories, then we need to make sure we choose the correct one, because the correct one is going to accurately map from the initial inputs through the computational chain, through the information processing chain to the outputs. But if they're both adequate descriptions of behavior, which one is correct? Well, how do we know? We'd have to actually look at how it's implemented. If we had two different theories which explain two different causal chains, we Ramseyfy them both, so we get, there exists such and such mental states, such that if X is in pain, there exists mental states, 1, 2, and 3, and at T0, I am in M2, right? Like, if we want to do that with our particular theory, we got to make sure it's the theory that describes the information processing steps. But we don't know that without looking, right? And each theory does just as good a job of explaining the behavior. So we kind of really don't know which one we want to Ramseyfy and make part of our existentially generalized theory of the mind. And that could be a bit of a problem. But maybe we can get a little help from machine functionalism. So Josh is asking, remind me, in this case, are we talking mental states to mean the sort of computational processes that happen in our brains that relate? Yeah, basically. In our case, it's the mental states that are realized by the brain, but it doesn't have to be a brain. You could apply this same analysis to a computer, to a robot, to a non-human animal, to an alien, and the physical implementation would be different because of multiple realizability. But yeah, we're looking like so we've got T1 and T2. They both do just as good a job of explaining the behavior. Well, which one is correct? Well, it depends which one describes the actual computational process that's being realized, right? Yeah. Yeah, I think you've got it exactly right there, Josh. Okay, so let bring it back to machine functionalism. Kim reminds us that there are internal physical states of S that realize the internal machine states of the Turing machine in question. That is, there are in S real internal physical states that are causally related to each other and to sensory inputs and behavioral outputs as specified by the machine table of the Turing machine. It is the requirement of physical realization that answers the question of the psychological reality of Turing machines purporting to specify the psychologies of a subject. So, which theory is correct, as I was saying a moment ago, is whatever theory picks out the real internal states, that is mental states of S. So it's the theory that correctly describes the logical states or the information processing states that are physically realized in S. So we get this principle. The states that the Ramseyfied psychological theory, TR, affirms to exist are the physical neural states. That is the variables, so M1 and M2, etc., of TR. And in the definitions of specific mental states, so the simple definitions of pain and so on, they range over these physical neural states of the subjects of the psychological theory. And now knowing that, what we have is a means of knowing which theory is the best one, right? It's going to be the theory that actually describes the computational steps from inputs to information processing steps to outputs. And this is what scientific psychologists do. This is what cognitive scientists do. Kim, again, is emphasizing the law-like nature of these relations. A lot of these, and maybe why psychologists call these effects is because, these are contingent upon how the human brain has evolved and how individual subjects' brains have grown and developed. Like it could be otherwise. We could be made of different stuff and have different brains that realize things differently. But our psychological theory gives us law-like descriptions of actual mechanisms that are like the physical realizations of these Turing machines that we are. And that's what cognitive scientists do. They say, okay, I have these two theories that could explain how, I don't know, the cocktail party phenomenon. This is what early cognitive psychologists did, right? So they'd build information processing models, and maybe there are two different information processing models of the cocktail party phenomenon that do an equally good job of explaining why I can pick out someone saying my name in like a noisy room with a lot of people talking. So there's two theories that do just as good a job of explaining that behavior. Which one is correct? Well, we can actually map out the information processing steps in the brain to see how they are realized, and that will tell us which model is describing things correctly. This is all so cool. Like, I nerd out about this. Like, oh man, I nerd out about this so hard, but this is how we figure out how this works, right? By combining philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, all mix it up together, and you can explain how the mind works. It is just so, so cool. Okay. I'm getting a little too excited here. So are there any questions? And then we'll take another quick break because my voice, I'm not losing my voice, but it is a little scratchy. Well, I think I'll answer any questions. We'll take another quick 10 minutes, and then we're going to do something fun. What do we think? The last part, you mean the part about what cognitive scientists do? Yeah. So like we could have two competing theories or two models, and each model explains what's going on in the mind differently in terms of the information processing steps that are occurring to get from inputs to outputs. So different little boxological diagrams, right? They both do just as good of a job, but they can't both be right. The one that's correct is the one that correctly describes the information processing steps that are realized by the brain. So what we have to do is run experiments. We can do experiments in psychology, experiments in neuroscience, where we actually look at what the brain is doing. And then we can see which model is the right one. Because it doesn't have to just explain behavior. It has to explain the information processing steps that occur between the inputs and the outputs. And the one that does that correctly and also explains behavior, that is the correct theory. And that is the bread and butter of psychologists, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, and some philosophers of mind, like the more empirically oriented ones. Does that make sense, Joseph? Okay, perfect. All right, so I have 8 minutes after 4. Let's come back at 4:18. And then we're going to do a couple of interesting thought experiments and wrap it up. So I'll see you all in about 10 minutes. Yeah, Joshua. Yeah, real quick. Yeah, basically, yeah. Like one model might predict like maybe both models explain the behavior equally well, but one makes a prediction and the other makes a different prediction. So then you do another experiment and see whether you see the predicted behavior from theory A versus theory B. And if you get one or the other, that lends credence. It doesn't prove that one is correct over the other, but it's evidence in favor of one over the other. Yeah, and that's what psychologists do. Neuroscientists would be more interested in looking at the implementational details, but a psychologist would say, this theory predicts behavior A and this predicts behavior B. Let's see what behavior we observe, right? Yeah, it's so cool. Science is so freaking cool. Yeah, so awesome. All right. Okay, let's come back at 18 minutes after 4. I'll see you all shortly. Let's resume. Yes, Lee, thank you for reminding me. I'll set that up right after class so that I don't forget about that. So the Dropbox will be in, I'll put the Dropbox in this week's module because it's due on August 1st. Okay, so that's where you'll find it. Let's get back to sharing the screen and do something fun. So we got to talk about some objections and difficulties with the whole functionalist project. And before we get to Kim's examples, I thought I would start out with this fun little example that I put in some of my lectures. This is the dress. Now, the dress refers to both this picture of the dress, as well as an online debate that it ignited in 2015. It went viral on Twitter. Before I explain, I want to ask you all, what color is this dress? And please, as many of you as possible, put your answers in the chat. Okay, white and gold, white and gold. Oh, really? You're all seeing white and gold. I don't have anyone seeing blue and black? Oh, Josh sees blue and black. Great. Good. I'm glad we had at least one. I see it as white and gold. The actual dress is blue and black. Like if you were to go and look at this dress, it is blue and black. Yeah, like May says. Yeah, that's correct, May. And that's what happened is a young woman was picking up this dress for her wedding. I think it was the bridesmaids. This was the bridesmaid's dress or something. I don't think it was the wedding dress. So she takes a picture and sends it to like her mom or her mother-in-law, something like that, and or maybe it was the other way around. Anyway, the point is, person gets the picture and says, "What? This is white and gold. I ordered blue and black." And the other person was like, "What are you talking about? I'm looking at the picture. I'm looking at the dress. It's blue and black. What are you talking about?" So she uploaded it to Twitter. It was like, "What color is this dress?" And there were two groups. The dress is either blue and black or white and gold. Yeah. Well, yeah, but it's not completely an in-camera effect though, because different people perceive this picture different ways, right? I have tried to mess with the conditions, the viewing conditions when I look at this picture, and I always see it as white and gold. But the dress is blue and black. And a lot of people, when they look at the picture, see it as blue and black. So Holly says, if she tilts her screen, I can sort of see blue. Yeah. Let me try that. Look at my peripheral vision. I can kind of see blue, but I still see gold. So yeah. Oh yeah, Kaya. I think you're right. Yeah, like if it were photographed in better conditions, or if you were just looking at the dress in real life, you'd see it as the proper color. But for some reason, the way the picture is taken, some of our brains say it's blue and black, and other brains say it's white and gold. Yeah, maybe. Well, yeah, and that's a good point, Joseph. Like if people have different rods and cones and stuff in their eyes, maybe people will perceive it differently. But this is a segue into one of the complaints against functionalism, or one of the critiques of functionalism. And that is qualia inversion. So I thought I'd just insert this because it's fun. And usually when I do this in person, I get a bigger reaction. Like I get students actually arguing with each other over what color the dress is. And that's kind of fun. Um, and it reminds me of qualia inversion, right? And that's the inverted spectrum argument. Um, so the motivation here. Oh, interesting. Okay, I'll try that, Samuel. I'll try that myself after. Well, no, you know what? Why don't I try it now? I really want to see this dress is blue and black. So, what did you do? You put your head against the top right corner of your computer. Okay, I'm going to try. Let's see if I can. Um, oh, I still see white and gold, but maybe that's because of my monitor. Mm. Oh, interesting. That's an interesting possible explanation, Leo. Like where your brain expects it to be lit from. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and Holly, that's true. There could be a cultural thing going on. Like color terms vary across languages and cultures. So in your example, yeah, there are many words for different shades of blue in Russian. So just because of the way that Russian speakers interact with different blue objects in the world, they can make more blue discriminations than, say, an English speaker. Um, yeah, a little demonstration picture of Samuel with his head near his computer. Yeah, if you hide the blown out backdrop, let me see if I can hide it. I have a big computer monitor. No, it's still. I think I'm just stuck seeing it this way. Um, But yeah, how do people see white from the blue? I don't know. Like I'm stuck with white and gold. I have never been able to make it look blue and black. That's just the way my brain is handling this, I guess. It's a bit like another similar example was the Yanny versus Laurel phenomenon that also went viral a few years. It was a particular set of sound waves that some people perceived as saying Yanny and some people perceived as Laurel. Um, Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. Like what there's a lot of stuff going into this, but the point is to segue into this objection, which is that now the motivation behind the qualia inversion example, as I was saying, is to show that functionalism doesn't really deal with qualia. Remember, qualia are the subjective, sort of phenomenological features of our conscious experience, the what it's like aspect of our experience, right? Um, there's something that it's like to perceive the color red. Um, and it's different than what it is like to perceive the color blue. And not just with colors, right? There's something that it is like to enjoy a sip of coffee. And that is different, qualitatively different from what it is like to eat a slice of pizza or something else, right? There's something that it's like to eat pizza. There's something that it's like to enjoy coffee. There's something that it's like to look at the blue of the sky versus the red of the sunset. They're qualitatively different. So, plural, all of these subjective, ineffable, sort of phenomenal components of our experience have come to be known as qualia or quale, singular. So, this red right here at a wavelength of 700 nanometers is a quale. This blue right here at 500, that is a different quale, right? Now, uh, the inverted spectrum. Imagine if you and I have flipped spectra. So when I look at something whose surface is reflecting uh, a wavelength of light or light with a wavelength of 700 nanometers, I see this color. But yours is inverted to mine. So where I see red, you would see this indigo color. but you would still call it red. And so we could both look at objects, say, look at that apple, that's red. And you would say, why, yes, it is red. But your inner experience would be of this indigo, and mine would be of this. And we would have no way of knowing, unlike the dress, we would have no way of knowing if our inner experiences are different. And functionalism doesn't really address any of this, right? You would think that our correct psychological theory would be able to explain like why red things are red as opposed to some other color. But you could have an inverted spectrum and on a sort of functionalist theory of mind, and we would have no way of knowing, right? So Josh says, just split the difference, spitballing here, but perhaps the difference in experience originates from difference in the hardware of our processing units. For example, if the mental states are functionally the same, cause the same inputs and outputs, but perhaps one person's brain causes them to see blue and black, whereas another person's brain is hardwired. Maybe. Here's the problem, right? We can't solve this problem with the tools of the cognitive sciences. Like it's clear in the case of the dress that people have different colors. But in the case of the inverted spectrum, we wouldn't know, right? Because let's say, for example, you scan my brain when I'm looking at a red object. So the wavelengths of light are about 700 nanometers. So they affect the photoreceptors in my eyes in such a way that they fire at a certain rate. They would actually fire at a rate which reflects the wavelength of light. And certain ones would be sensitive to certain wavelengths and not others. But once you get into my visual cortex, they're firing with a certain frequency. It's the same with sound. Like if I'm hearing a sound of a certain frequency, like, I don't know, 440 hertz, my neurons are firing at that rate, right? Okay, so fine. There's still nothing in there that explains why this wavelength of light looks red and not indigo. There's still nothing physically going on that explains why an A, 440 hertz, sounds different than middle C, right? Because those are subjective, those are qualia. And functionalism doesn't really deal with this. This is, again, we'll get into this when we get closer toward the end of the course, but this has a lot to do with what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, right? The easy problems are the ones that we can solve with the tools of cognitive science, right? And when I look at a red object, how do the cells in my rods and cones and my optic nerves and in the occipital lobe, what's happening there? Well, neuroscience can tell us. But what it cannot really tell us is why red looks like red and not some other color. So maybe, and this might be kind of related to what Josh said. Maybe my mental state is realized by a neural state. And as long as the neural states are the same, we can't really differ. Like if my color neurons in my brain are firing at a certain frequency and certain of them are firing, and that's the same in each of us, then we can't differ with respect to qualia. But again, that doesn't really address the problem because we're dealing with the hard problem. It also doesn't help us if we're talking about physically different systems, right? We know that non-human animals can perceive color. Some of them have certain kinds of color blindness, like dogs can't see certain colors. I think cats can see certain colors, but not many. And then, of course, there are birds that can see all of the colors that we can, and they can even see colors that we can't, like into the ultraviolet range of the EM spectrum, right? So this is kind of like the problem that we had with identity theory. Like, oh, well, we're just in the same neural state. Well, now we're back to the problem we had with type physicalism. And we saw that didn't work. It's not going to help us here. But, maybe this is also a problem for physicalism in general, because the idea seems to be that the qualia supervene on the physical states. So the mental states supervene on physical states, brain states. Qualia are a kind of mental state, so maybe they just supervene on mental states. Um, but that's a general problem that physicalism suffers from, not functionalism specifically. And we'll have to circle back to this at the end of the course. But yeah, it's perfectly plausible that where I see red, you see violet, but we would both point to the object and say it's red. So it's the inverted spectrum is different than the dress. It's different from like cultural and linguistic color terms, right? Like maybe a Russian speaker can differentiate between different shades of blue that I don't notice. Does that mean I don't see the different shades of blue? No, probably not, right? It's just that the way I categorize those colors is different owing to the language um, that I speak, right? And there are a lot of examples for this. In Homer, the ocean is described as being wine dark. Now that doesn't mean the ocean is like a dark red, like red wine. It just means that it's dark like wine, and the ancient Greeks would have seen the same ocean that we see. It's not like it would have looked red to them or something, right? Um, so, any questions about qualia inversion before we go on to the cross-wired brain example? It strikes me that the cross-wired brain is also kind of addresses, I think, some of what Josh was saying in his comment. But we could imagine something like this, right? Following Kim. Imagine each of us has a pain box and an itch box in our brains. We can think of the pain box as consisting of a bundle of neural fibers somewhere in the brain that gets activated when we experience pain. Similarly for the itch box. And it might help to actually draw this. So I'll draw this with my crappy mouse cursor here. Okay, so I have here's my pain box. Let's put P. And I have an itch box. So I. And I have different inputs and outputs. So my inputs for pain could be tissue damage. And my output is pain behavior, like winces and groans. And similarly for my itch box, I have, I don't know, let's say SI for skin irritation, and then the output is S for scratching. So the idea is that these boxes and their inputs and outputs represent some kind of neural system that's in our brains, right? Now suppose further, following Kim, that a mad neurosurgeon rewires your brain by crisscrossing both the input and output channels of your brain and itch centers. That is, the signals from your pain receptors now go to your former itch box, and the signals from this itch box now trigger your motor system to emit winces and groans, and vice versa. So we take this input from here. I wonder if I can change the color. So we take this input and we put that in here. And likewise, these outputs connect to here. And then we also rewire our itch box so that our itches go, our skin irritation goes into the pain box, and the output of the pain box is scratching. So that's the cross-wired brain. Now, on a functionalist view, we're still instantiating the same pain-itch psychology. But really, this is a variation of the inverted qualia problem. Do you see why? So here we still have a box where something goes in and produces the right sort of output. Only instead of the tissue damage inputs going to the pain box, they go to the itch box. Instead of scratching behavior coming out of the itch box, pain behavior like winces and groans comes out. So now we have the right input output information processing chain. But what's the problem? Do you see the problem? Maybe if I hop on over to the next slide. Nope. I didn't put the answer on the slide. What is the problem? What are your intuitions telling you? If I took my pain box, or a mad scientist took my pain box, and took the inputs and outputs from my itch box and hooked them up to my pain box, and then I stub my toe and I go, ouch, looks like I'm in pain, behaviorally speaking, but what's the problem? Well, yeah, the pain box on a functionalist view has turned into the itch box and vice versa. So Lee, you're correct about that. But the problem is, as Leo points out, is that you'd feel an itch when you experience tissue damage and then wince and groan. So I stub my toe, I feel an itch, but I go, ow. Yeah, like Joshua says, like my inputs and outputs are the pain stuff, but I'm not feeling pain. I'm feeling itch. And so this is another example of the inverted qualia problem. It's just a different sort of example, right? So if your intuitions align with this, then you're going to say, wait a minute, okay, sure, I have inputs like tissue damage and I have outputs like winces and groans, but hold on, if it's going into my itch box, then I'm experiencing an itchy sensation and not a pain sensation. A functionalist would say I'm in pain, but my intuitions would say I'm experiencing itch, even though I'm exhibiting pain behavior. So the functionalist explanation doesn't seem to work here, right? That's what this is meant to illustrate. It's a fun little example, right? And maybe your intuitions don't align with this. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. But if they do, then what that indicates to you is that there's a problem with functionalism, or at least something that it has yet to explain, namely qualia, right? That's what thought experiments are for. Thought experiments are not like scientific experiments where they give you an answer that supports one theory or another, or that falsifies a hypothesis or whatever, right? No, thought experiments are meant to help clarify to us, the thinkers, what kind of intuitions or beliefs or underlying assumptions we are bringing to a problem. That's what they're for, right? And I think the inverted spectrum argument and the cross-wired brain thought experiment are pretty good ones. Daniel Dennett called them intuition pumps, thought experiments in general. They get our intuitions pumping, and that's so that we can sort of check whether we're thinking about a problem in the right way or the wrong way. That's what thought experiments are for. There's another objection that we're just going to skip because I don't feel like it. Um, but does anyone have any questions about any of the thought experiments we've conducted here and what they mean for functionalism? Hey, maybe some of you are like, I don't care. I don't think this is a problem. Maybe we don't even need to worry about qualia. You know, maybe some of you think along those lines, and that's okay. But let's talk about role functionalism versus realizer functionalism to wrap things up. So most functionalists either believe or want to believe the following four things. Psychological cognitive properties are multiply realizable. Yeah, okay. There are different ways of implementing psychological or cognitive processes. We can implement mental processes in different physical substrates. That's pretty straightforward, right? Therefore, they are irreducible to physical properties. It's not that a mind has to be a brain, right? But a brain is a sufficient means of realizing a mind. Maybe a computer is also a sufficient means of realizing a mind. Just how a calculator like what a calculator is not reducible to what it's made of. You can have a pocket calculator with a little circuit board where everything's hardwired in. You can have a virtual calculator on your smartphone, so that calculator is just software, and the hardware doesn't really matter. You can have an abacus where it's hardware, but it's a completely different kind of hardware. That's not what makes a calculator. What makes a calculator is what it does. So that, that sort of thing is not reducible to the physical stuff. But just because these multiply realizable properties are irreducible to physical properties, that has no effect on their status as legitimate scientific kinds. So I can talk about mental states as real things. I can be a realist about mental states, not just an instrumentalist. So it follows from that the cognitive and behavioral sciences form an autonomous science irreducible to more basic lower level sciences like biology and physics. We can't reduce or eliminate psychology. We can't get rid of mental states because they're not reducible to these physical things. That's what functionalists believe. So functionalists, again, are not reductive physicalists. They're non-reductive physicalists. But maybe this apparent reducibility is due to the sort of focus we have on low-level realizers. The implementational details in the brain. If we focus on these too much, we might lose sight of their unity as properties. We'd be missing the forest for the trees. So instead of looking at realizers, we can look at the roles of the realizers. And this is role versus realizer functionalism. So here's how Kim describes the latter, realizer functionalism. My experiencing pain at time t is identical with my C fibers being activated at t, where the C fiber activation is the realizer of pain in my particular case. It's different in the case of, say, the octopus. The octopus is experiencing pain is identical with its X fibers being activated. I don't know if octopus really have X fibers. I suspect they have some kind of nerves. Whether they're anatomically similar to C fibers is out of my That's a bit out of my wheelhouse, but we can say that whatever fibers the octopus has firing, that's the realizer of octopus pain. And if my C fibers fire, that's the realizer of my pain. And so on and so forth. The property instantiated when I experience pain at time t is not identical with the property instantiated by the octopus when it experiences pain at time t. So the emphasis is not on the roles. We're saying the realizers are distinct, and the properties that they instantiate, being in pain in my case and in the octopus's case, they're also not identical properties. Role functionalism changes the emphasis from realizers to the role that the realizers play in an entity's mental life. So role functionalism says my experiencing pain at time t is identical with my being at t in a state that plays causal role R. And that in that case, that causal role is detecting bodily damage and triggering the appropriate responses. The octopus is experiencing pain at t is identical with its being in a similar state, in a state that plays the same causal role, etc. Throughout this sort of list of examples of creatures with minds. So my pain and the octopus's pain share the same functional property, that is being in a state with causal role R. So on realizer functionalism, me and the octopus, our pain realizers are realizing different properties, but on role functionalism, we're realizing the same properties, and that is both properties being a state with the same causal role, to indicate to the organism there's been tissue damage and to cause escape behavior, winces and groans, etc. So again, following Kim, as he says on 188, where the realizer functionalist sees differences and disunity among instances of pain, the role functionalist sees a similarity and unity represented by the pain's functional role. So, and then where we sort of differ here, beyond just whether these properties that are instantiated in across different minds are the same or different. Uh, Beyond that, another difference that arises is what properties are the subject matter of psychology or the cognitive sciences. A role functionist would say it's the role properties, like the causal roles. If the causal role of these two different instantiations of these properties are the same, great. And moreover, that's what we ought to study as psychologists. So, what we want to do then is discover what kinds of laws and regularities hold for these properties across different organisms with minds. Or maybe they won't even be organisms. Maybe they could be artifacts, computers, robots. If they can, if we could implement these role properties in them, then it looks like they would have mentality too, right? So we want to discover the laws or regularities that hold for the role properties, and we can do this without worrying too much on the implementational details. But the role properties still have to be causal and nomological. So, as Ross and Spurrett, quoted in Kim, say, the foundational assumptions of cognitive science, along with those of other special sciences, deeply depend on role functionalism. Such functionalism is crucially supposed to deliver a kind of causal understanding. Indeed, the very point of functionalism, on role or realizer versions, is to capture what is salient about what systems actually do and how they interact without having to get bogged down in the microscale physical details, in those little lower level realizer details. What do you think? Should the job of the cognitive sciences be to focus on those lower level realizers that I mentioned before and treat, say, for example, the instantiation of my pain and the octopus's pain as instantiations of different properties because they have different lower level realizers? Or should we focus on the role properties? Sure, the octopus pain and my pain are implemented differently, but they play the same functional role. They both cause, I assume, an unpleasant experience in the octopus, and certainly for me. They cause winces and groans for me, and perhaps they cause the octopus to shoot some ink and swim away, just as they cause me to go, ow, and withdraw my whatever body part I've hurt from the painful stimulus. That's what they have in common as instances of pain. I guess I sort of am leaning toward role functionalism, but I do think it's still worth paying attention to lower level details because we can always learn something. And remember that our theory, whatever theory is correct, is the one that correctly maps the input-output relations. And it would seem to really know whether we had a correct theory that correctly captured the information processing steps between inputs and outputs, we would need to look at realizers. So I kind of think it should be a little bit of both. Then again, I'm not a leader in this field, obviously. My opinion might not count for much, but it seems to me that we don't have to worry about the implementational details, but it still might be a good idea to be aware of them. I don't know. What do all of you think? Philosophers, engineers, psychologists, we have a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds. I'm curious to hear what you think. Holly agrees with me, Holly, or with for both. Yeah, like a two-pronged approach. Yeah, I agree. Like, sure, what makes stuff an instance of pain is the role, but when it's like when I'm in the trenches doing the actual work in a lab, I want to know what theory's right, and I need to know about the inner. I need to know about the causal change, right? The causal chain, I should say, that takes us from inputs to outputs. So maybe a psychologist is going to be more of a realizer functionalist, and a philosopher might be more of a role functionalist. But we're all ultimately engaged in the same project, which is understanding the mind. So yeah, I'm fine with a hybrid approach. Um, Leo says, to me, realizer functionalism sounds like it aligns with neuroscience and role functionalism with psychology. Yeah, that's kind of like how I see it. I think maybe I would say role functionalism. Yeah, philosophy and psychology, where if you're a neuroscientist, you're more interested in the implementational details. But again, we're all feeling our way around the same elephant here, right? So Josh agrees with both. You might discover things you weren't expecting by studying both compared to just one. Yeah, I agree. Um, that is all I have for today. So next time we're going to look at mental causation. This is where we get into the worry of epiphenomenalism. The extra reading is actually not one that Kim refers to in his further reading section. It's just an old lecture from Thomas Henry Huxley. It's a classic, and it's easy to follow. And it talks about the sort of history. Well, it's called the hypothesis on the hypothesis that animals are automata and its history. And he goes from Descartes all the way up through the 19th century and looks at the history of the idea that animals are automata, and he concludes that animals, including humans, are conscious automata. And Huxley's lecture is widely regarded as the first sort of like really comprehensive articulation of epiphenomenalism. And that's going to be a concern for Kim in this chapter. So I thought it would be fun if you wanted to read that. So take a look if you want to. It's a classic. Um, Holly adds, when it comes to the role versus realizer stuff, implementational details was sort of the birth of constructionism. Uh, so this is an area of psychology that I'm not super familiar with, Holly. Can you tell us a bit more about constructionism?
Well, like theories of emotion, completely changed with neuroscience. We thought that
Mm,
emotion was sort of reactive when in fact, neuroscience taught us that like looking at how it's implemented taught us that we construct emotions almost prior to the event. So
hmm.
you do need to study both, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Um, all right. Interesting. That's not something I'm too familiar with. I've usually treated emotions more philosophically, um, but yeah, I can kind of see what you're saying. I mean, like some of the psychological theories of emotion treat emotions as means of representing, uh, like it's how an organism represents the significance of things that are happening to it. And so those kind of input output relations have to like already be there, or like they develop. We're not just programmed with emotions, but um, yeah, emotions are fascinating. Um, but yeah, not too familiar with constructivism, but that's interesting. Thank you for that. Um, if there are not any other questions or concerns, then yeah, that's it. Um, so real quick, if there are, go ahead and ask away. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up. Okay. Well, I guess I'll see you all on Wednesday for mental causation. So, yeah, please read chapter 7. Read Huxley if you want. I think you should. Um, but required reading is Kim's chapter. Okay. I'll see you all on Wednesday, everybody. Yep, and I'm gonna end the recording, and then I'll meet with you, Holly, once everybody's out. So ta-ta for now, everyone.